Hi there, and thanks a lot for joining the On Philosophy lecture series hosted by The Philosopher, which is the UK's longest running public philosophy journal, published quarterly. Details about the journal are in the slides which you just saw. I'll post a few things to the chat function. Any ways in which you can support us would be greatly appreciated, because we're volunteer run and obviously struggling in the same way that a lot of small independent publications are in these strange pandemic times. So I'm delighted to be hosting an event featuring Philip Goff and Raymond Tallis, two people with extremely interesting perspectives within the area of philosophy of mind and consciousness. The topic tonight will be panpsychism. So Philip's going to be the main speaker in conversation with Ray. And obviously, as we know, panpsychism is a very unusual doctrine. The title of the talk tonight, panpsychism is not just for hippies, comes from Colin McGinn's quote from a 2006 paper where he refers to it as a complete myth, a comforting piece of utter balderdash. Isn't there something vaguely hippyish, i.e. stoned, about the doctrine? So I think throughout the past year, Philip has weathered a strong backlash, especially from materialist thinkers who think that he is undermining a certain orthodoxy that has emerged in the philosophy of mind. On the other hand, Philip has a huge number of supporters, not least Philip Pullman, who said that following Philip's work, the universe appears in a new and much more revealing perspective. So whether you're on the side of McGinn, Pullman, or just want to find out a little bit about what panpsychism actually is, I think that we're certainly in a new era of expanding our conceptions of what the mind is, what consciousness is, and Philip's very much been at the forefront of this revolution, if you want to call it that. So I will welcome Ray and Philip in a second. Like, Ray will be introducing Philip. I'm delighted to have Ray as Philip's interlocutor because he's someone who's been incredibly supportive of the Philosopher. He's also come several times to speak at some of the events we run. He's a really lovely chap, puts out a cracking book pretty much every year. We did a long review of his latest book, Seeing Ourselves, which relates to the false dichotomy between science and religion when we come to think about humans. And he wrote a very complimentary review of Philip's book, not entirely agreeing with it, but nonetheless seeing it as an extremely persuasive and interesting account. So I think we'll get Ray and Philip up on the screen. I'll sink into the background. I hope you really enjoy the event, and please post any questions to Philip or Ray using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Thank you.
Well, Anthony, thank you very much indeed. It's lovely to be virtually back in the Northeast. I'm going to start my video. I've just been instructed. Hopefully, yes, I can see my own face, so I must exist. And thank you for that lovely introduction. This is a real pleasure to be here tonight, particularly because I'll be talking to Philip. And it's so nice to be talking about a different pan from the pandemic. So we're going to talk about panpsychism. And just to introduce Philip, Philip is a philosopher, of course. He got a first-class honours degree at University of Leeds way back when. He then did an MA in philosophy in the University of Reading, and that's where he did his PhD. He has published nearly 50 serious academic publications and published 4 books. One particular book I would strongly recommend to you is this one, Galileo's Error, which actually is the framework for tonight's discussion. Galileo's Error, Foundations for a New Science of Consciousness. And it's this where Philip strongly makes the case for panpsychism. As I say, it's a terrific read, irrespective of whether you agree with its conclusions. So, Philip, without more ado, could you tell us what panpsychism is in just a couple of sentences?
Yeah, thanks, Ray, and just thanks, Anthony, for inviting me to do this. It's really great to be here virtually. It was originally going to be in person, physically in Newcastle, but it's great to do this, given that that's not possible. What is panpsychism? So I guess in our standard way of thinking about things. Consciousness exists only in the brains of highly evolved organisms, and so exists only in a tiny part of the universe and only in very recent history, cosmically speaking. Whereas according to panpsychism, consciousness in some sense pervades the universe and is a fundamental feature of it. So it doesn't literally mean everything is conscious. The basic commitment is that the fundamental constituents of physical reality have some kind of very rudimentary kind of experience. It might be electrons and quarks, might be universe-wide fields, and that the complex, highly evolved experience of humans and other animals is somehow built up from or derived from consciousness at these more basic levels. So that's the basic idea, really.
Oh, thank you. And I mean, it is a profoundly counterintuitive, and it's a view that's very much at odds with the current philosophical consensus. And Anthony described some of the abuse you've received as a result of being a panpsychist. So you've probably arrived at that route by setting aside some of the more popular alternatives. And I wonder if you could very briefly tell us what's wrong with materialism, and then I'm going to ask you what's wrong with, e.g., dualism or indeed idealism. So perhaps you could tell us what's the problem with materialism before we talk about the case for panpsychism.
Yeah, so that's very much the motivation, that addressing the problem of consciousness, trying to find a way to understand how consciousness fits into our overall theory of reality. We know that consciousness exists. Nothing is more evident than the reality of feelings and experiences. So it has to fit in somehow. The problem is all of the different theories that seem to try to do this have just such deep difficulties. So as you say, that the two conventional options, when I was an undergraduate in Leeds that you just mentioned, in the dying embers of the 20th century, we were taught that these were the only two options: materialism, that roughly you can explain consciousness in terms of the chemistry of the brain, or dualism, that consciousness is non-physical, outside of the physical workings of the body and brain. And yeah, I mean, I came to think that both of these conventional options have just such deep problems. So you asked about materialism. I mean, look, there's a huge debate here, but I think the core of the issue is that physical science works with a purely quantitative vocabulary, whereas consciousness is an essentially qualitative, quality involving phenomenon. If you think about the redness of a red experience, the smell of coffee, the taste of mint, you can't capture these kinds of qualities in the purely quantitative vocabulary of physical science. And so as long as your description of the brain is framed in the purely quantitative vocabulary of neuroscience, you're just going to leave out these qualities and hence really leave out consciousness itself. And one thing I try to press, hence the title of the book, is that we shouldn't be surprised that our conventional scientific approach struggles with consciousness, because our conventional scientific approach was designed to exclude consciousness. So Galileo, key moment in the scientific revolution, Galileo says that the new science is to have a purely mathematical language, a purely quantitative vocabulary. But Galileo knew quite well that you can't capture consciousness in these terms. You can't capture the qualities of consciousness in this mathematical language. And so Galileo says, look, right, if we want to have a mathematical science, we have to put consciousness outside of the domain of science. It's only once consciousness was out the way that mathematical physics was possible. And so I think this is really important because, a lot of people have this idea, this very powerful narrative. Look at the great success of physical science in explaining more and more of our universe. Of course, it's one day going to explain consciousness. And I think that's rooted in a misunderstanding of the history of science. Yes, physical science has gone incredibly well, but it's gone incredibly well precisely because it was designed to ignore consciousness. So I think, the fact that it's gone very well because since it ignored consciousness shouldn't really give us grounds to think, oh, it's going to be an appropriate tool to. I mean, physical science has a lot to offer to I want to emphasize that neuroscience is absolutely crucial for a theory of consciousness. But I don't think, because of this clash of the qualitative and the quantitative, I don't think it can give us a total, complete account of why consciousness exists.
Thank you. I mean, that would be a critique of scientism, but not necessarily of materialism.
Well, it depends. Good point, Ray. It depends what you mean by materialism, and it's a very ambiguous word. It's quite funny, actually. So people get very passionate about being a physicalist or a materialist or an opponent of these views, but it's not at all clear, how they're to be understood. And in my academic book, I have half a chapter on this issue and consider a lot of different options. So look, the way I tend to, my standard definition of materialism is the view that we can exhaustively capture the fundamental nature of reality in the purely quantitative language of physical science. I think that captures what a lot of people hold. I think it captures actually what is in the public mind. I think people have this idea that physics is on its way to giving us this complete story of space and time and matter. So I think that does capture a lot of what people mean by materialism. So that's my primary target.
Yes. Things
do get more nuanced in my academic debates, where doesn't capture what everyone means by materialism, and we can adjust the definition. But that's certainly the definition I use in public discussions. Maybe you think that is a too scientific notion of materialism, but
that sounds good to me. So basically, materialism is disposed of. Why aren't you a dualist?
Yeah, good question. And I used to think they were the only two options, and I think maybe towards the end of my undergraduate degree, I was a sort of closet dualist. I thought this is a terrible theory, but I didn't think there was any alternative. And I actually left academia and felt a bit disillusioned and tried to do something else and tried to forget about it. But yeah, I guess the problems with dualism, are perhaps of a more straightforward scientific notion, scientific kind, that most dualists, although they think the mind and brain are distinct, they think they stand in a close causal relationship. Yeah. So, with the mind wants the arm to go up, it makes changes in the brain and the arm goes up, or in the other direction, if light hits the retina of the eye, makes changes in the brain, the mind has a visual experience. So, if there were an immaterial mind impacting on the brain every second of waking life, I think that would really show up in our neuroscience. There would be all sorts of things happening in the brain that had no physical explanation. It'd be like a poltergeist was playing with the brain. And that's not what we seem to find. Yeah. The way I've been expressing it recently, the relationship between the mind and the brain for a dualist is a little bit like the relationship between a drone pilot and his or her drone. Yeah. And, we receive information from the sensors and we control it. Now, if you physically examine the mechanism of a drone, you can see where the radio signals come in from the pilot. So by analogy, if dualism is true, we ought to be able to see in the brain where the signals are coming in from the soul. Yeah. And not all dualists like the word soul. David Chalmers told me off the word, but the immaterial mind, the non-physical mind. And that's just not what we seem to find. So maybe we keep missing it, but I think this is a growing inductive case that that's not the right way to think about the relationship between mind and brain as two separate entities.
And that's set out beautifully in your book, that you would expect all sorts of anomalous and unexplained things to happen from a neurological point of view if you were a dualist. So that's basically, you've cleared the decks now, and then we need to look for the positive case of panpsychism. Because that's quite a brave thing then to embrace, as you've discovered to your cost, as it were. And,
yeah, well, advantage as well. I think it's
a lot's
changed in the last 5 or 10 years. Actually, I think it's gone from being a view that was treated as absurd insofar as it thought of at all, to being, a view that's, apart from these kind of over-the-top Twitter discussions with certain senior philosophers, I think is now taken very, very seriously. As a, albeit minority academic, there's a huge amount of literature and Oxford University Press volumes on the topic. Interesting, actually, there's going to be another Phil Papers survey I just saw announced, in the first one in 11 years. It surveys the views of philosophers. It'd be interesting to see where panpsychism features now. Yeah. I suspect it'll be, you know, a fairly substantial minority view. But yeah, so I think actually the reason there's been a resurgence of interest in it is main in academic philosophy is mainly due to the rediscovery of certain important work from the 1920s by the philosopher Bertrand Russell and the scientist Arthur Eddington, who was incidentally the first scientist to experimentally confirm general relativity. Yeah, so as I like to say, I think these guys did in the 1920s for the science of consciousness what Darwin did in the 19th century for the science of life. And it's just a tragedy that it was forgotten about for so long, but it's recently been rediscovered and is, you know, causing a lot of excitement in academic philosophy. So this is partly why everything's so specialized these days. So I wanted to write, I've got an academic book on this, but, you know, I wanted to get these ideas out to a broader audience. Okay, but so if I could just share their essential insight. So I think that the starting point of Russell and Eddington was that physics doesn't really tell us what matter is. And, you know, that seems like a very odd claim at first. You know, as I say, there is in the public mind, this idea that physics is on its way to giving us this complete story of space and time and matter. But I think what Russell and Eddington realized is that for all its richness, physics is confined to telling us about the behavior of matter, what it does. You know, physics tells us that particles have mass and charge, and these properties are completely defined in terms of behavior, things like attraction, repulsion, resistance to acceleration. It's all about what stuff does. Now, intuitively, there's more to what something is than what it does. So I like to give the example of chess pieces. I'm not sure if I gave this example in the book, actually, but so think about chess. If you're playing chess, you're interested in what the pieces do. You're going to want to know what moves you can make, what pieces you can take. But there's more to the physical nature of a chess piece than what it does. There's also the nature of the matter it's made of. Is it made of wood or metal or plastic? So this is what philosophers sometimes call the intrinsic nature of something. What it is considered independently of what it does. So now, by analogy, you know, think about, say, fundamental particles like electrons and quarks. You might very well be interested in what science has to tell us about the behavior of these things, what they do. But you might also be interested in the intrinsic nature of an electron, what an electron is considered independently of what it does. And actually on this topic, physical science just has nothing to say. So what's this got to do with consciousness? So the thought is there's this huge hole in our standard scientific story of the universe. And the proposal of Russell and Eddington is to put consciousness in that hole, right? We're struggling to find a place for consciousness. Materialism can't do it. Dualism can't do it. We've got this hole. Maybe we can put consciousness in the hole. So the view is there's just matter. This is nothing supernatural or mystical. Maybe particles or fields, but matter can be described from two perspectives. So physics describes it, as it were, from the outside in terms of its behavior, what it does. But matter from the inside in terms of its intrinsic nature is constituted of forms of consciousness. So it's this beautifully simple, elegant way of bringing these things together. In the 1620s, Galileo separates out the quantitative and the qualitative. I think in the 1920s, Russell and Eddington have a way of bringing them back together. So that's the picture I find very attractive.
Yes. And one of our means of access to intrinsic nature of things is, I think, according to your book, our own brains. I mean, the one item, as it were, we are or know, we can nip round the back of the veil of appearance, as it were, in virtue of being something. So because we do know that our brains are conscious, and it's on the basis of that we can infer, and I hope I'm not misrepresenting your argument, that basically consciousness is the intrinsic property, is an intrinsic property of what's out there. And I just wondered, there seem to be two problems there. One is extrapolating from our own brains, from that which I am, and the other is basically translating instantaneous or immediate experience into knowledge. There are probably two aspects of the same thing, but it's slightly worrying, isn't it, that the only object of which we can be sure that it is intrinsically conscious is, if one believes it, one's own brain, or indeed oneself in some ill-defined sense, and then we have to extrapolate to the rest of the world. I think that's a problem.
Yeah, I think like this approach sort of turns the usual way of understanding the mind-body problem on its head. Normally you think, we really understand what brains are from physical science, but consciousness is the mystery. How do we fit that in? But actually, I mean, Eddington certainly said, it's actually the other way around. It's matter that's the mystery. We've had absolutely no idea what matter is. We know a lot about what it does, and that's really useful information. Allows us to create incredible technology, but we don't really know what it is. The only insight we have, Russell said, the only window we have onto the intrinsic nature of reality is, as you say, our immediate awareness of our own experience. So for a Russell-inspired panpsychist, when you attend to your experience, your pleasure, your pains, your visual experiences, you are attending to the intrinsic nature of your brain, the physical stuff of your brain. So in a sense, you know your brain better than a brain scientist. The neuroscientist knows a lot about what your brain does and what its bits do, but it doesn't know the intrinsic nature of your brain. You attend directly to the intrinsic nature of at least part of your brain. But yes, but now there is this extrapolation, I suppose. So, well, I suppose I have part of the case I have made, and Eddington made a similar kind of simplicity-based argument that when you've really got to get in this mindset, because it's so hard to get out of the conventional idea that we really know a lot about what matter is. Once you really know, actually we don't know. The only thing we know about matter is that one bit of it, namely brains, has a consciousness involving intrinsic nature. And then say we're just speculating, from that starting point, I think the most simple, parsimonious speculation about stuff the stuff we don't know about is that it's continuous with the stuff we do know about, and also having a consciousness involving nature. So I mean, that's just, I mean, that's not a, it's not a, it's just a starter. It's not a knockdown argument. But simplicity considerations are very important in science. I think we try and find the simplest theory compatible with the data. But I mean, ultimately, I think that the selling point for the view is we want an adequate theory of consciousness. And I'm very precise about what that means. I think we need a theory of consciousness that fits the empirical data and that avoids explanatory gaps.
Yeah.
Where you have emergence without explanation. You have X emerging from Y and just no account of how that happens. So I think it's easy to satisfy one of these. I think the dualist can get rid of explanatory gaps. They just postulate, a dualist like David Chalmers just postulates basic laws to bridge the gap between the physical and the mental. I think that's a legitimate strategy. I think, science appeals to fundamental laws all the time, but they have problems for the reasons we've discussed, fitting the empirical data. Conversely, the materialist has no problem with this sort of data of third-person observation and experiment, but they have this massive explanatory gap between the purely quantitative properties of neuroscience and the qualitative properties of consciousness, and no one's ever made even the slightest progress in bridging that gap. So the trick is to be able to do both. And what I believe is that the panpsychist is able to construct a theory of consciousness that does both of these things. And so, we've got very strong reason to take it seriously as the best explanation of how consciousness fits into our theory of reality. So that's ultimately the motivation for it, rather than these simplicity-based considerations.
Oh, well, thank you for that. I mean, one of the problems, I guess, is that there does seem to be a privileged relationship between macroorganisms like you and me and in particular our brains and consciousness. But if it's consciousness all the way down, or it's present all the way down, one has sort of questions like, supposing electrons have a smidgen of consciousness, how does that smidgen of consciousness gather together into a conscious subject like you and me? The combination problem. What is it about brains that makes them seem to be particularly intimately related to a very special form of consciousness? So should we deal a little bit with the combination problem of,
yes,
let's suppose that the basic stuff of the universe consists of atoms or electrons. How do they all gather together to create something like a conscious subject like you and me?
yeah, this is a big challenge, and this is what most of the activity of the contemporary panpsychist research program is focused on. So I see it, and we're really getting into the details a bit now. So I see it as a question of the relationship between biological human animal consciousness and these more fundamental forms of consciousness. And broadly speaking, as I outline in the book, there are two approaches to understanding the relationship: strong emergence and weak emergence. So the strong emergentist panpsychist postulates basic principles of nature to bridge the gap. So it might just be a sort of basic law of nature that when conscious particles are arranged in a certain way, you get consciousness associated with the whole system. It's just a fundamental law of nature. The weak emergentist tries to account for biological consciousness without such extra principles of nature. They try to make sense of the idea that merely having conscious particles arranged in a certain way is in and of itself sufficient to get consciousness of the whole. So I think both of these have deep challenges, not unrelated, it must be said, to the challenges of dualism and materialism. So, the problem with the strong emergentist picture is you'd expect, on this view, systems with emergent consciousness to behave very differently to systems without emergent consciousness. In fact, I think you'd expect them to obey different laws of nature, because they've got these radically new forms of macro level forms of consciousness popping up, and you think that would really make them behave very differently. And that's not what we seem to find empirically. Seems, from what we know empirically, brains obey the same laws of physics as any other system. I think that the weak emergentist of panpsychist avoids that problem. The problem there is no one's ever really found a fully adequate way of making sense of how just arranging conscious particles in a certain way is enough to get consciousness associated with the whole. Although there are very good approaches. Luke Roloff's, his book Combining Minds last year, is really excellent, making progress in this issue. But what I've been exploring recently, and is under peer review at the moment, is a sort of hybrid position where so we divide between experience and subjects of experience. So a subject of experience is just a thing that has experience. And we are strong emergentists about subjects of experience, or just subjects for short, but weak emergentists about their experiences. So there are basic laws of nature that ensure in certain circumstances in that consciousness emerges associated with local systems, but these there are subjects of experience associated with local systems, but those minds, if you like, if you want to think of them as minds, but those new minds, those new subjects of experience, they don't come along with their own brand new forms of consciousness. Rather, they inherit streams of experience from the more fundamental level. So this is supposed to close the explanatory gap with sort of basic principles of nature, explain why subjects emerge, but also because they're inheriting consciousness from the more fundamental level, this is supposed to explain why they don't behave much differently. They don't obey different laws of nature to any other physical system. So that's the approach I'm currently defending. And it's a rather than a particles-based view, actually, I think it works better thinking that the fundamental forms of consciousness are sort of universe-wide fields. And I think that also fits well with most modern physicists, if they're thinking theoretically, tend to think in terms of universe-wide fields being the fundamental constituents rather than little particles. Yeah. Sorry, that's a bit long-winded, but that's
no,
getting really
actually
into the
not.
details there, but that's how I tried to solve it.
Yes, and it just seems to me you have a fundamentally different viewpoint on the world, and I wonder how it's changed the way you interact with the actual world. And secondly, that you, in a sense, you've argued yourself to a position that probably very few people you know outside of professional philosophy actually occupy. So, first of all, how does it change your view of the world? And how do you cope with the fact that most people around you aren't panpsychists?
That's a great question.
You might want to take legal advice before you answer either of those questions, of course.
Yeah. Yeah, what difference does it make? I suppose so. I mean, the first 4 chapters of Galileo's Error are just the cold-blooded case for the view, but then the final chapter does explore its implications for human existence. And so I always say that I think as scientists and philosophers, we should be thinking not about the view we'd like to be true, but the view that's most likely to be true. And that's what drives me. I want to know, what the world is like, and I do think there's a good case for the truth of panpsychism. I mean, who knows what the truth is? Early days, the probable truth of panpsychism as the best account of how consciousness fits in to our overall theory of reality. But I also think panpsychism is maybe slightly more consonant with our mental and spiritual well-being in some way. I mean, materialism is sort of pretty bleak. You've got this mechanistic view of nature and the cold immensity of empty space. Whereas on panpsychism, we're conscious creatures in a conscious universe. I sort of think it's a picture of the world in which we sort of fit in a little bit more, can feel a little bit more comfortable in our skin. I also talk about how, I think, perhaps more importantly, I think it is potentially a view where we can have a better relationship with the environment. If you think of a tree as just a mechanism, then your conception of its value is really just indirect. It's about what it can do for us in terms of sustaining our existence or looking nice. But if you think a tree is a conscious entity, albeit of a very alien kind, then I think we see it as a locus of moral significance in its own right. Chopping down a tree is an act of immediate moral significance. And so, these terrible forest fires we've been seeing in Brazil, we're all horrified by. If you think of it as the burning of conscious organisms, though, I think that does add another dimension. So I do sort of speculate about what it would be like to be a child raised, in a panpsychist, seeing plants and trees as conscious entities. Although my own children are not buying it. But anyway, my daughter said, do you think trees have feelings? She said, no, they're just outside. They don't think about anything.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because I noticed you picked out trees, living organisms, as it were, but pebbles, you're quite pebbleist, presumably. You don't have the same respect for pebbles.
No, so this is a common misapprehension. People think the panpsychist thinks, rocks and socks and tables and chairs are conscious. But just because you think the fundamental constituents are conscious doesn't mean every random arrangement of them are. I think I'm attracted. I think it's so I think we need to distinguish quite sharply between the sort of more experimental part of consciousness studies and the theoretical part or the philosophical part. So I think we should look to neuroscientists to tell us what's the best account of how conscious states and physical states correlate. And then as philosophers or theoreticians, we account for those correlations.
Yeah.
There's interesting developments in biopsychism, people who think that life is necessary and sufficient for consciousness. This is, a respectable development in biology, philosophy of biology, philosophy of neuroscience. These people are actually not really sympathetic to panpsychism in general, but that's for on empirical grounds. So I suppose that's why. So I think it's an empirical question: which macro level things are conscious? And I don't think we've got much reason to think pebbles are conscious. But then we have to explain where consciousness comes from, how to account for it. And I think that gives the theoretical postulation of consciousness at a more fundamental level.
Yeah.
But there's never a need to think pebbles are conscious, I don't think. I mean, they might be, who knows? But I don't think we've really got theoretical reason to suppose that.
On a note of strong agreement, thank you. We'll finish our conversation here. Thank you. That was absolutely terrific. And I think, Anthony, you're kindly going to now, as it were, facilitate the Q&A.
Yeah, that's
Just let
the
me say,
plan.
say thanks very much, Ray, and I've really enjoyed your work, and it's got a lot out of our interactions, and it's a great privilege for you to take the time to do this. Thank you.
Oh, it's a real pleasure.
Sorry to interrupt you, Anthony.
No, not at all. Thank you so much for a great conversation. I mean, there's loads of questions coming in. That's partly why I offered earlier to come in, so that Ray can still be involved in the conversation rather than having his head buried in questions. So I thought I'd start with a couple of simple ones that require short answers. So Doug Hill asks, what are some of the works on consciousness by Russell and Eddington that are now being rediscovered?
Yeah, so the key one for Russell, and I guess the big one, is the analysis of matter in 1927, where he develops. I mean, he doesn't quite develop a panpsychist version, because he sort of has a slightly unusual view about mental states not necessarily being experienced, but it's the basic idea that we don't know the intrinsic nature of matter, and it's the intrinsic nature of matter that somehow directly constitutes or explains consciousness. So this general view in the academic literature has become known as Russellian monism. And there are panpsychist and non-panpsychist versions of it. And I've got a lot of time for both of them, really. I tend to talk more about panpsychism because, well, I do favor the panpsychist forms, and it's a bit easier to explain than the other forms. But I'm very open to both the panpsychist and the non-panpsychist forms, and they've both been well developed in the literature. With Eddington, his Gifford lectures of the next year, which were published as The Nature of the Physical Universe, I think it's called. So they're the two main ones. I mean, there's lots of important stuff connected to Whitehead at the same time. People always tell me off for not talking about Whitehead more. There was very similar discussions going on. So there's just some really great pioneering work that somehow, I don't know, I think sort of the maybe anti-philosophy zeitgeist of the post-war years of logical positivism, and it's sort of got lost. And they're the two main ones.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. So this is a question from Serena Lloyd, and this was something you touched on briefly towards the end, but I think it's an interesting question. She asks about the role of non-epistemic elements in your work. She says, what kind of account of matter should we have for reasons other than simply metaphysical truth? And she puts in brackets conceptual engineering. So from the little I know about that phrase, it's the idea that part of metaphysics isn't just about describing the world, but shaping our concepts in a way that we want, such that they have a value within the world. They link to how we want the world to be, rather than just the way the world is, independent of our interest as humans.
That's interesting. So what is the question about whether our theory of reality should be shaped by pragmatic usefulness, or for us rather than?
I think, well, the way she phrased it was about the role of non-traditional metaphysical kind of questions to do, for example, with what kind of conception of matter do we want? Obviously, you said earlier you thought the sort of picture of materialism was very bleak, alienated us from the world around us. So I suppose she's asking if there's a sort of normative element that's actually important in the generation, or do you rely primarily upon the reasoned arguments to defend?
I think I would be. I'm probably going to disappoint. What was the name? Sorry.
Oh, Serena Lloyd.
Serena. So I probably disappoint Serena that I suppose I'm maybe a bit old school in thinking, we should be firstly trying to work out our best guess of what reality is like, and then exploring the implications for human existence. But there's very different questions. I mean, the crucial question, even when we're thinking of epistemic considerations, the crucial question is, what are the data? I think a lot of people have the idea, we just look at the data of third-person observation experiment. That's how we find out what reality is like. But I think if you religiously stick to that, you will have no grounds for postulating consciousness. because we know about consciousness not on the basis of third-person observation experiment, but through our immediate awareness of our experience. So I think Dennett is wonderfully consistent on this, Daniel Dennett. He thinks, we don't know about consciousness on the basis of third-person observation experiment, so it doesn't exist, at least not in the sense I'm talking about here. So so I think we need to think about, we need to think that the job of science is to capture the data of third-person observation experiment and the reality of consciousness. And I think that's a fundamental datum in its own right, over and above the data of third-person observation experiment. And we need to find the simplest theory that can account for both. That's what I'm most passionate about, actually. I don't think as a scientific community we are there yet. Most people won't deny the existence of consciousness. Of course, consciousness, but they don't see the implication of that is that we have to take the reality of consciousness as a datum in its own right, over and above the data of third-person observation and experiment. I mean, that doesn't immediately lead to panpsychism or even the falsity of materialism, but taking it seriously as a datum for our fundamental theorizing about the world. It might mean physicists have to think about, does my theory accommodate the reality of consciousness? That's a million miles away from how we currently think about things. But if it is something we know to be real, then it's got to be accounted for by our fundamental theories. Sorry, that was a bit long, but I'll try and make sure.
Yeah, Ray, obviously, like, while I'm going through and picking a few out, you can do the same, and we can kind of
I mean, that's a really interesting question, because the whole notion of a datum, that which is given, tends to be intrinsically third person, because it's that which is given and that which can be corroborated or checked and so on. So the sense of what is the case is very much connected with third person observation. And just coming back to one of your earlier points, Philip, it just seems to me that, of course, Galileo marginalized secondary qualities, conscious experience, etc. But what is extraordinary is, having done that, how powerful, effective, with such explanatory, predictive, and indeed practical force science has had. So if it was a mere error, as it were, to confine himself to objective data, wow, I wish I could make such errors,
Yeah, no, I'm very sympathetic to that, Ray. So I've got this provocative title, but yeah, I think maybe it was important for a period of time to ignore. Yeah, I think basically what Galileo did was limit the scope of science. He just said, that's too hard. It can't, just focus on what we can capture in mathematics, and that's gone really well. And but I think we're now going through a phase of history when it's gone so well, people are like, this is everything, and the wonderful technology has a visceral effect on your metaphysics, I think. But I think if Galileo were to time travel to the present day, he'd say, well, and hear about this problem of explaining consciousness in the terms of physical science, he'd say, of course you can't do that. I designed it to deal with the quantitative, not the qualitative. It's done so well because it wasn't supposed to deal with consciousness. So I think now we're at a time in history where physical science is developed enough that we can start to bring consciousness back into the story. And what I'm calling for is really, I'm not saying we can't give a science of consciousness. I'm saying we need a more expansive conception of what science is, as you say, Ray, not just dealing with third-person data, but the first-person reality of consciousness that we know to be real. So yeah, that's what I'm most passionate about, more than panpsychism, is moving to that more expansive conception of science.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, cool. So there's a question from Beth Lord, who will be in the equivalent of Philip's seat in about a month's time to discuss Spinoza in relation to the Anthropocene. I suppose she's asking about a different legacy, intellectual lineage. She says panpsychism has many historical adherents: Spinoza, Hegel, and the medieval Neo-Platonists, for example, all of whom were arguing against materialists and dualists in their own day. To what extent is your understanding of panpsychism influenced by these historical sources, and to what extent do you engage with their ideas?
Absolutely, yeah, that's a really good question. Thanks, Beth. So yeah, I mean, there's such I mean, it's very dominant historically, panpsychism, as you say, Spinoza, Leibniz in the early Enlightenment, and you know, it's only really, and in the 19th century, is in many ways the heyday, and it's only really the latter half of the 20th century where it really falls out of favor. I think because of this sort of over enthusiasm with the success of physical science. And yeah, I mean, I discuss a lot of the history, and I wrote the panpsychist Stanford Encyclopedia entry, and you know, to go through the history there. And I think there are precedents for the view I defend in Spinoza, in Schopenhauer. I think, you know, in many ways, Schopenhauer's response to Kant says, you know, we can't know the thing in and of itself. And Schopenhauer says, well, there's one bit of the thing in and of itself we know, you know, our own minds. And he has this idea that will is the nature of matter. So there's a clear precedent there for the Russell type view in Spinoza. I suppose I'm not someone who focuses, to be honest, and you know, I'm not proud of this much going into historical stuff. I mean, I try to read a lot and, you know, talk to people who know better than me. But yeah, I you know, and I'm always interested to hear more. But I suppose I'm not someone who specializes in, you know, going into great detail about historical figures, panpsychism or otherwise.
Okay. Super. So the next question comes from local philosophical legend and former editor of the Philosopher, Michael Bavage, who you would have met, Philip, had you come up to give your talk at the Lit and Phil before the pandemic hit. So Mike asks, physicalism and panpsychism share the belief that there is a straightforward question about the relationship between consciousness and the physical world. A third option is that the question is incoherent, starting with the fear that the concept of consciousness is itself confused. What is your reaction to the idea that there is already a mistake in the setup of the traditional question?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And yeah, there's some very interesting views in this area. I guess, you know, reminds me a little bit, although this might not be the spin Michael has on it, that Wittgenstein's approach with the private language argument. There's an audio recording of me debating that with Hanako Benyami on my website, and I've always found the private language argument a bit question begging at the crucial moments, I think. But maybe I won't start trying to articulate that now, as I'll start rambling. But yeah, I mean, look, I'm open to all these views being explored. I'm quite interested in, you know, my friend Keith Frankish, who defends the idea that consciousness doesn't exist, or phenomenal consciousness, if you like. Although that's not because it's confused, that's a more sort of an empirical case. I suppose I just think I don't buy it. Ultimately, I think, you know, nothing is more obvious and straightforward and clear as people think of consciousness as a mystery. It's often said in the popular discussions, it's a mystery what it is. I don't think it's a mystery what it is. I think, you know, nothing is more familiar than feelings, experiences. The mystery is how they fit into reality. So I suppose it just seems to me a quite straightforward idea we have of, you know, you tend to a feeling and you form a concept of how the pain feels. And then, you know, in the latter half of the 20th century, you know, people like Wittgenstein start to think this is confused. But I always think that they're starting from a certain philosophical position. And, you know, this conception of consciousness doesn't fit with that philosophical position. Okay, maybe we should question that philosophical position. So, yeah, I mean, I'd want to hear the arguments, I suppose, as to why what seems to me like a quite straightforward and universal concept is some confusion. But you know, I'm definitely up for the debate. I wouldn't say, oh, you know, that's a stupid position to defend at all.
Okay, cool. So I've lined up a few that we could call like quick fire questions. So like short questions that you could give very kind of quick fire answers to before addressing a couple of longer ones. So number one, does consciousness exist without humans? From Jacques Ray.
Yes, well, yeah, animals are conscious for a start. I think we should all agree on that. I think I'm inclined to think plants and trees are conscious. And I think the fundamental constituents of reality are conscious, whether they are fundamental particles or strings, or whether they are universe-wide fields, as in the theory I currently defend. But apart from that, that's it. So it's not like your socks are conscious.
Okay, from Stephen Davis, this is quite a pithy one. Is there something it is like to be the whole physical universe?
Depends on the form of panpsychism you're defending, as I say. So there are these particle-based ontologies, but there are if you start with the idea that the fundamental physical components of reality are universe-wide fields, and so on a panpsychist view, they're the fundamental forms of consciousness. I think that does lead to what's called a cosmopsychist for panpsychism, where the fundamental conscious entity is the universe. But it's important to emphasize, that it doesn't mean it's God or an intelligent mind. It could be its consciousness is just a mess. And you only get personality and intelligence and reason with millions of years of evolution by natural selection. So yeah, just because you think the universe is conscious, I mean, there's all these cultural connotations of the views. It doesn't. I mean, you could take it in a kind of spiritual direction, but that's not. If you're just trying to account for consciousness, I don't think you're likely to be led there, even if you do think, strictly speaking, the universe is conscious.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because that in a sense generates the opposite problem to the aggregation problem. So the aggregation problem is how does sort of microparticles add up to a conscious subject, a macroscopic conscious subject like us? And the opposite one is how do you get disaggregation of a single conscious universe into individual viewpoints and such as us? But it just seems to me that we're just going back to the earlier question about whether we're simplifying things by thinking of something called consciousness and something called matter, that the universe is absolutely irreducibly dappled, as Nancy Cartwright would say, in of a multiplicity of things that cannot be, as it were, homogenized into a couple of metaphysical substances. And it brings me back to the Schopenhauer example. I mean, Schopenhauer's idea was, okay, there's the in itself, taken from Kant, the phenomenal world, taken from Kant, and we can actually know the in itself, or the world in itself, the noumenal world, because we can nip round the back of the veil of appearance by being a bit of that. And that brings us to the whole question of how can we generalize, as it were, from ourselves to an in itself? And that really relates to that earlier question about the worry about homogenizing what is there into, say, a couple of substances or whatever.
Yeah, well, Nancy Cartwright is my colleague here at Durham, actually, and
she is,
yeah. Too many discussions about this, but yeah, so you do have those. I guess I'm more closer to common view of materialists and naturalists, that we should be trying to find the most simple, elegant, parsimonious view, and I guess, I don't know, some people think, like Nancy, maybe I'm not sure exactly how she just found, but that's it's a mistake to try and the reality as it seems we find it is lots of different kinds of overlapping, very different kinds of entity. So these are deep questions. I'm not sure I have a simple answer to, but I suppose that's my starting point. Is you take the data, and we can only work with the data we have. We're not gods. You take the data you have and you try and work out the simplest theory that can accommodate it. I think the data is third-person observation experiment, what we know about human consciousness and what we can kind of speculate about animal consciousness. We try and find a simplest theory that accounts for that. And I think this panpsychist view is the simplest theory that does that. And that, that's just our best guess that we humans are capable of what reality is like. It doesn't mean it's true. It may very well not be true. I think some people, again, this is connected with a certain kind of scientistic attitude. Some people think you have to be able to prove it's true and get very nervous. So I'm not saying I can prove panpsychism is true. I think it's just our best guess, really. Yeah.
Okay, so there have been a few questions about idealism, because I think earlier on Ray promised that you would refute dualism, materialism, and idealism, but right. I think you just did dualism and materialism. So someone asked about a contemporary idealist called Bernardo Kastrup,
right.
What you thought of his theory. But I thought I'd ask first of all Peter West's question, which is on a older variation of
right.
Idealism, where he says, how do you feel about the line of argument, which goes all the way back to Berkeley, that once you accept the most fundamental or indubitable data we have is of the mental, you have inevitably opened the door to idealism. So I suppose there's Berkeley, there's Kastrup, and then there's your general refutation of idealism.
Well, I certainly don't think I've got a refutation of idealism or any of these views, really. Peter West, currently my colleague, I think, if it's the same. Yeah, I guess I don't buy, it's different forms of idealism. I guess I don't buy Berkeley's arguments that we can't even make sense of a non-mental reality. I'm perfectly open to the possibility that the fundamental reality might be non-mental, and even that non-mental stuff might produce mental stuff, unlike my fellow panpsychist Galen Strawson, who thinks we can sort of rule that out a priori. That kind of Berkeleyan idealism, although Michael Pelchar is a very good contemporary proponent of it, and my former colleague Howard Robinson, I think there's a worry about how you account for the common world we seem to experience. Why is it we all look here in the same direction? We all see a table. Berkeley has God looking at it. So, but I think, the simplest answer to that is there's, light back. There is a table out there and light bounces off it and hits your eye, that the answer the materialist gives. So I think that's my response to that kind of Berkeleyan idealism is better than a constantly intervening God. It's a bit inelegant. Bernardo, well, we've both written articles discussing each other's views, and had lots of discussions on Consciousness Live, and it's a very, very interesting view that I've got a lot of respect for. Where did we end up? I guess I've got a number of issues that how to close the explanatory gap. And I think, things I've criticized Bernardo about, I've said, you've got these explanatory gaps in your theory, how you get from, so he has a sort of universal consciousness thing, but it's not actually the physical universe, it underlies the physical universe, and then our minds emerge from that. And I was saying, you haven't closed the explanatory gap there, you haven't given an intelligible story about how they emerge. And I thought he was taking that he had done, but he sort of admits that he hasn't done that. And so, yeah, I think that's just what's really driving my work, is to try and close explanatory gaps. And what I've tried to do in my latest view is to close explanatory gaps in an empirically adequate way. And I think that's that. So if Bernardo had a way of kind of closing the explanatory gap, I'd say, oh, this view is definitely right. But in the absence of that, I think, it's a really interesting view, and I've got a lot of time for his view, but I'm not totally on board without an empirically acceptable way of closing the explanatory gap. Also, in our last discussion, it turned out he was a little bit of a Mysterian, in the sense that we don't know the intrinsic nature of this fundamental consciousness. He's got this kind of quantum Bayesian view that we quantum mechanics doesn't tell us what reality is like, it tells us sort of what questions we can ask. So, and I find that dissatisfying. I want to try and have a theory of reality where we completely understand what's going on. So that is also one reason I'm slightly resistant to Bernardo's view. But I mean, I take these are all, the reason I don't spend more time refuting idealism, I was thinking that these are all very closely related views in the same ballpark.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I mean, Ray, you're something of a Mysterian yourself, I think, at least according to your recent book, but we can come back to that in a minute. I mean, unfortunately, there's been a huge number of questions, and I'm really sorry to everyone who hasn't had their questions answered, but obviously, I hope you've really enjoyed the event. I thought I'd end with a question which perhaps both Ray and Philip could speak to, because certainly Ray's written a lot about this. It's to do with AI, which obviously, according to Jesse, who's asked this question, assumes a vague materialist view that with more processing power and larger data, it's only a matter of time until What are the stakes in the project for AI from a panpsychist view, and can AI not be a good test case for realizing the makeup of consciousness? So obviously Ray could maybe offer his perspective, not necessarily from a panpsychist perspective, but from someone who is skeptical of the materialist orthodoxy. So Philip, do you want to start, and then Ray can say it, and then we'll wrap it up?
I mean, I don't think there's any obvious connection with implications that panpsychism might have for AI that materialism wouldn't. I mean, the crucial question for AI I'm more focused on is the connection between thought and mental representation and intelligence and consciousness. And people, I don't think, realize this is a controversial matter. You know, for most of the 20th century in Anglo-American philosophy, these things are completely different. Intelligence and thought is just something kind of mechanistic or functionalist, or it's nothing to do with consciousness. You see, there's the big figures like Donald Davidson, Jerry Fodor, their theories of thought. Daniel Dennett had nothing to, you know, didn't mention consciousness at all. So then if you're deciding a system that's artificial intelligent, then you don't need to think about consciousness. But there's a growing movement now that I'm part of as well. Like, you know, is another group position that was non-existent that's really come to force, is the view that thought is a kind of consciousness. It's a sort of highly evolved kind of consciousness. And now when we're thinking about artificial intelligence, we've got to think about how do we get a system that's conscious. So I think that debate is really underexplored. I mean, the one way to just phrase it is, suppose you've got a silicon duplicate of a human that hasn't got consciousness, but, you know, can talk about the pandemic and articulate its thoughts on the global economy. Does it really understand those things? Does it really have opinions on global economics, or is it just parroting them? It depends whether you think thought and understanding are dependent on consciousness. And I think that's really underexplored discussion in the AI community.
Okay, Ray, I mean, unfortunately, we're kind of at the time. Do you have any final words for Philip? A final question, a summation before we end the event?
I mean, I agree 100% with basically what Philip just said. The division of problems of consciousness into the hard problems and the easy problems is fundamentally wrong. Intelligence is no easier than qualia type consciousness, because basically there's no such thing as intelligence without qualia type consciousness. Artificial intelligence is basically just causal interactions between an unconscious entity and the world outside of it. So I don't think increasing computational power or increasing computational complexity will generate any kind of complex artificial intelligence, simply because any intelligence that a computer has is actually borrowed from those that use it. So, for example, a computer that's able to win a game of AlphaGo will have much more computational power than I have, but actually doesn't have any consciousness at all. In fact, it's not even aware of winning a game of AlphaGo. It is I who actually use it to win a game of AlphaGo. But that's another story. But what I particularly like about what Philip's saying is he's really provoking us to say, well, hang on a moment, materialism doesn't work, dualism doesn't work, idealism doesn't work. Now, my response to that is to be ontological agnostic. But I think Philip's much braver than I am and saying, hang on a second, let's embrace something else that seemed to survive the critique of all those other views. So I salute your bravery, sir.
Well, thanks, and thanks so much for taking the time to just really enjoyed this discussion. And
bye-bye.
I wish we could be, I wish we could have got there in person and could talk for, but I'm sure we could carry on this discussion. Yeah.
Well, Ray always refers to epistemology as the appropriate response after an event. But unfortunately, I think we're just going to retreat to our own little bedrooms, and that's just life. But hopefully, you can come and give a talk at the Lit and Phil at the next available opportunity, Philip. So I've left a link to Philip's book via his publisher, Penguin. Obviously, Ray's holding it up triumphantly, and thank you both so much. Thanks, Ray, for some really great questions and always keeping it fun, and thanks, Philip, for addressing a lot of very diverse questions in a really clear and fascinating way. I mean, I never take in everything that's said at the time because I'm sort of monitoring the Q&As and the chat, but I always love listening back to it. And I know that tonight's been a really great event. So thank you. The next event, we've got 2 events next week. I've put the thing into the chat function, and I will put up a slide in a minute. So thank you for joining, and obviously please support the Philosopher in any way you can. And thanks to you both. Thanks to everyone for joining, and I'm sorry to everyone whose questions weren't asked. There were so many of them and so little time. But I know, in fact, Philip's doing an event tomorrow night, because I saw it on Zoom, like the Arthur Conan Doyle Society or something.
Yeah.
So if you feel like your questions weren't asked tonight, maybe you could join that and
belong to that.
we'll get it in then. So, all right. Well, thank you very much, and good night to everyone.
Thanks, Anthony.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ray.
Thank you, Philip, and thank you, Anthony. Lovely.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Okay, I'd probably better dash because it's very late for my.
Of course. Well, lovely to see you, and
yeah.
And
hope we get a chance to have a beer sometime.
Yes, please. Absolutely.
On the side of this. Brilliant. Okay, take care, Ray. Thanks
and you too as well. Cheers. Bye.